Okay. Good morning, everyone. Bruchim Habayim. Shavua Tov. Our special guests from Chicago, Cleveland, Eretz Israel, and beyond. It's my honor to welcome you this morning. I'll introduce Rabbi Ephraim, who will say a few words, and introduce Adina. Just on behalf of the Kollel, we are honored to gather this morning in memory of our beloved friend and teacher and mentor and inspirational role model, Tzipi Rimel Alea Shalom, and her daughter Noam Rachel, and Neshama should have an aliyah. Yesterday we read about Rivka Imenu, that on the one hand she was associated with the midah of chesed, complementing Yitzchak's gevura. On the other hand, that go-getter attitude also had an element of gevura. There was an element of strength, of fortitude that she had, and that quality really reflects in many ways the way that we benefited from the wisdom and the tenacity and the brilliance and the vision of Tzipi Alea Shalom, that she was a person of chesed, but she also had a shtickle gevura. She knew what she wanted to do, and she was definitive about it, and she was committed to it, and she saw it through. And so she challenged all of us to continue to grow, to look toward the Ribono Shel Olam, to Eretz Israel, to the Mashiach, to our values, to our Masorah. And we are honored to gather today in her memory to continue that chizuk, both of chesed, the warmth that she showed to so many in the community, especially her students, but also the gevura, the commitment to the values that we live. B'chavod Rav, Rabbi Ephraim.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Brand. It is it's great to see so many familiar faces. And many of the people that are here on the screen today have reached out and have been in touch throughout the last 2 years and since we've returned to Israel. And it that also gives a lot of strength, a lot of chizuk, knowing that there are so many people that are rooting for us throughout. Last night there was a gathering that we met many students of ours from Chicago, many students who came especially to pay tribute, to come say hello, to remember Tzipi. And as Rabbi Rand mentioned, I think Rivka Imenu really had a special, I think many things that Tzipi had were mentioned already or cleared out already through Rivka. And it's probably not a coincidence that these are the parashiyot that we read now. And I think nothing would have made her happier than having another opportunity of getting together, learning Torah with many of her friends that she learned with for 4 years, and Adina, who they had a very strong connection while they were together. And I think this is a great opportunity to get together for Torah and hopefully for smachot in the future. Thank you very much for all of you, and looking forward to hearing you, Adina.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Brand, for perfectly setting the moment. And Ephraim, all I can think about right now is how good it is to see you. Belated happy birthday to you. And to everyone, I just want to invite you to use the chat, because if Tzipi were here, you better believe she would be reaching out to you to tell you how good you look, asking after your kids, sharing jokes. She would be very clever at what the public chat is and what she's personally chatting with people. So I invite all of you to really create a community during the time that we have together. And please ask questions through the chat or ask me to slow down. Those are very common requests when I teach via Zoom. Surrogacy in our day and age obviously has a very specific connotation, and I'm sure the title might have raised some eyebrows. And obviously since 1985 at least, it connotes what is a modern miracle that still continues to be mired in legal and ethical gray areas and certainly emotional complexity. But at its core, what surrogacy demands is that the woman who's carrying this baby sever any connection with this child and accepting that the destiny of this child is completely out of her hands. She is somebody who is facilitating a destiny, but it is not hers to shape. And it's an incredibly life-affirming act of kindness to be able to do that for somebody else, to enable a family and a future where there was otherwise a total block, total stop. But at the same time, I can't even imagine how complex, how challenging, how selfless, and how frightening it must be to be in that position. And I think many of us are aware of the commandment in the Torah of Yibum, that if a man dies without children, his brother is expected to marry the widow. Obviously, they may be released from this obligation through chalitza. However, as we also know in Masechet Yibum, the situations in which this would actually happen are very rare. There are a number of limitations. For example, it can only apply to fraternal brothers. The widow can't abandon the children. Both the brother and the widow have to be of marital age. Obviously, it's very limited. But this notion of Yibum is a thread running throughout Tanach. And this morning, I'd like to study with you 4 episodes in Tanach, where obviously they're not dealing with gestational surrogacy, but they are stories of surrogacy. They are stories of Yibum. And each story in its own way is mired in this complexity and confusion and selfishness and selflessness. And because it is not an easy thing to try to create a destiny for somebody else. And it is not so comfortable to be the vessel for somebody else's destiny. So we're going to begin. I'll share my screen and share all the sources via slideshow. Just give me just one moment. We're going to begin with the first family. The protagonist of Bereshit Perek Daled always seems to be Cain. He's the person who is obviously talked about. It's his challenges and his jealousy that obviously makes him the protagonist. However, when you notice how the story begins and how the story ends, there's an inclusio here. The story is bookended. The story of Cain is bookended by Chava. And the narrative begins and ends with Chava naming a son, giving a child a name. And the first name, obviously, is when Chava names Cain. And it seems her reaction to Cain's birth, it shows that she regards Cain's birth as this intensely spiritual experience. She says, Kaniti ish et Hashem. I've acquired a son with God. She names Hashem as a partner. And it seems like she used Cain as an acquisition. Named Cain, like the word kinyan, somehow she views his life as her mark in the world. And in contrast, when Hevel is born, the language used in a very intense way, emphasizes that the same importance is not attached to Hevel's name. There is no actual naming of Hevel. It simply says he is Hevel. Additionally, the word Hevel literally means nothingness, fleeting, transience. And so the subsequent story, the story of Cain's jealousy and Hevel's tragic death, becomes the story of Chava, because when you view it through her eyes, you can't help but wonder what is her responsibility in the raising of these children, and how his actions potentially show that Cain became what Hevel named him. She said, Kaniti ish et Hashem, and Cain's actions, in a sense, show that he views himself as a god. Of course, Hashem tries to nudge Cain in the right direction, trying to help him understand that man is godly in his free will, but man is not a god. And when the closing of the story shows the third child that Chava gives birth to, Shet, she names this child in memory of Hevel. Sheti Elokim Zera Acher Tachat Hevel, right? This child that is born, Shet, then becomes a memory for Hevel, for the child that she didn't name, for the child that she didn't think of the potential and destiny latent within him. This, loosely defined, is the first act of Yibum in the Torah. And the tension that Chava experiences in the naming of Cain and Hevel and Shet reflect, I think, a tension that we all have, the desire to be a Cain, to have a permanent mark in the world, while we recognize, as Shlomo HaMelech put it, how our lives are at the same time Havel Havelim. And this tension is in the story of the society of Migdal Bavel, the second episode I'd like to discuss. Because whether you say that the sin of this community is avodah zarah, as Rashi says, or a lack of desire to populate the world, as Ibn Ezra says, that they're not fulfilling Pru or Avu, or perhaps creatively totalitarianism, as the Netziv famously says, that this was a dictatorship and that the society was expected to all have dvarim achadim, one belief, and almost a form of communism, perhaps. Regardless of what you view as the sin of the story that necessitates Hashem's reaction, what blatantly stands out in the community, the builders of this tower, is their quest for permanence, their quest for something that will live beyond them in a way that seems to be almost foolish. When they're building the tower, they say to each other, their desire is to make a name, and this name is their quest for permanence. And the way that they view they're going to achieve that is through their accomplishments. And the story becomes a satire because Hashem simply looks down, Vayered Hashem, he comes down, and he simply scatters them. And he reminds them, and you can even see echoes that they too are Havel, they too are nothingness fleeting, and they become Bavel. And you almost see echoes of how the name is almost familiar. And it's foolish to think that you're going to create a lifelong destiny simply through what you build, what your accomplishments are. Creating a destiny, this story teaches us, has to be something so much more beyond that. This story then stands in contrast to Avram Avinu, who looms large and who is going to be introduced in the subsequent psukim. Because as we know, when you just think of contrasting on a basic level, Avram Avinu's life with the builders of this tower, Avram Avinu, he is a wanderer. He pitches a tent instead of building a building. And his life stands in marked contrast to the builders of Migdal Bavel. And in fact, the Torah emphasizes this by this juxtaposition, because immediately after the story of Migdal Bavel, the psukim race through the genealogies of the generations leading up to the birth of Avram Avinu. It's almost like the Torah is so excited to quickly introduce Avram Avinu that it quickly just races through these generations. And in the hurry to introduce Avram Avinu, the Torah forgets to share with us an important detail, which is, why was Avram chosen? What makes him so special? Obviously, so many midrashim shared about what makes Avram special and why he was chosen. There's a famous story shared by Nechama Leibowitz, where we all know the story of Avram smashing the idols. Nechama Leibowitz once entered a room to teach a group of soldiers, and she passes out Tanachim. You know, we all know the scene, the beginning of a shiur, somebody passes out the source sheets, everybody's just kind of like, shuffling in their seats, wondering when it's going to start, waiting in the Zoom room, as it were. And she turns to the group and she says, okay, everybody, turn to, in Tanach, Sefer Breshit, the story of Avram Avinu smashing the idols. And everybody just kind of starts sifting through the Tanach. And then a few people kind of get it and kind of just stop and wait. And one soldier keeps searching and grows more and more frustrated. And finally, he slams the Tanakh down on the table and he says, you gave me a Tanakh that's missing some pages, because the Tanakh that I had as a child had this story. And obviously, I think the story has so many layers and so many levels to it, like all great Gedolim stories. But something that I think is striking is that we know why Avram was chosen. Everybody knows why Avram was chosen, but why isn't it written? And when you do look at what is written, I think there's another reason that jumps out. There is something that makes this family special. Because, well, on the surface, there seems to be nothing. The details that the Torah does choose to provide show something very special about Avram's family, something that perhaps is a hint. The Psukim emphasize in Pasuk Chavchat, Vayamat Haran al pnei terech aviv be'eretz moladato be'or kasdim. And that's a red herring for the commentaries. Where exactly was Avram's birthplace, be'eretz moladato? Because Some suggest that is only Haran's birthplace, that is not Avram's birthplace. But this emphasis that Haran dies then forces the family to step up and to adopt Lot as their son. And so that is perhaps one detail, one window into what makes this family special, this necessary act of stepping up and accepting Lot as part of them, even where Haran is no longer there, to kind of, in a sense, keep Haran's destiny, take care of his family. There's another way in which this family is showing this kind of proto-Yibum. Chazal point out that Nachor marries Milcah, Haran's daughter. And the Psukim very strangely note, Shem Eshet Nachor Milcah, Bat Haran Avi Milcah, Va'avi Yiscah. That Haran actually had two daughters, Milcah and Yiscah. Chazal say that Sarai, named here Sarai, Sarah Imenu, is actually Yiscah. And so in that sense, what Chazal are also saying is that both Nachor and Avram are also performing a proto-active Yibum in their marriages, in trying to, not only in their adoption of Lot, but in their marriages, trying to keep Haran's destiny alive. And we know that when we're introduced to Sarai, she is an Akara. And so it seems that the expectations of this family from the start would be that Lot is going to be their heir. Lot is going to be their foster son. And our first introduction to Avram and Sarah basically spells out what a tension, a struggle for the rest of the lives will be, which is to figure out if they do not have their own biological son, how is it that they will be able to fulfill the promises that Hashem keeps telling them? And their life is laden with tension because, as we know, Lot eventually goes his own way. And this leads us to the third episode that I'd like to explore with you, which is the story of Avram and Sarah and Hagar. Because this story most blatantly is a surrogacy story, but this is a story where we also see the family struggling to understand how can it be that Hashem keeps promising them a destiny while not delivering on the necessary things needed to fulfill this promise or this destiny. Hashem keeps telling Avram Avinu, you're going to have a child, you're going to be the father of a great nation. And I put on the screen Bereshit Vav, the previous story where Hashem tells Avram, what we know as Brit Ben Abtarim. Hashem speaks to Avram about a destiny, a great nation, years into the future. And you can almost imagine Avram, closing the Zoom, hanging up the phone from his discussion with Avram during Brit Ben Abtarim, turning to Sarah and repeating back to her everything Hashem said. And the two of them looking at each other saying, that's amazing, that's wonderful, we can't wait to do this, except where is this child who is going to enable us to fulfill this? And so this leads directly to Bereshit Perek Tet Zayin, when it's Sarai's initiative. Sarai is the one who turns to Avram and says, let's try this with Hagar. Hagar presumably comes to their family from their time spent in Mitzrayim. After the beginning of Parshat Lech Lecha, Avram and Sarah arrive in Canaan and almost immediately faced with a famine. And so they travel down to Mitzrayim, and they're really chased out of Mitzrayim. Their presence is, towards the end of it, not exactly so welcome. And they're chased out laden with gifts. So presumably Hagar, she is known throughout at the beginning of the story, Shifcha Mitzri. Presumably she comes to their family from that scenario, from that situation. And it seems that their expectations of her are very much in line with what the expectations were during that day and age. And I'll explain what I mean in just a moment. Sarai basically offers up Hagar as a shifcha, right? She is a shifcha, that is her role in the family. Sarai offers up Hagar as a vessel for this child that hopefully they will have. Sarai is very clear. Pasuk Bet, V'tomer Sarai el Avram, Hinena atzarani Hashem miledet, bona el shifchati ulai ibana mimena. Maybe I will be built up through her. it seems that in Sarai's perspective, Hagar's status is not going to change. Hagar will still be a shifcha, but Sarai's status will change because presumably the child that might be born as a result of the union between Hagar and Avram would be considered Sarai's son. And Sarai says, Ibana mimena, I will be built up through her. I will be the one to benefit from this relationship. Hagar is basically a vessel for you and I to fulfill the promises that Hashem keeps reminding us of. And that seems to be very much in line with Mesopotamian society. I'll put a source on the screen. This is one Mesopotamian marriage contract. And more famously, Rav Chanan Samek quotes this repeatedly from the Code of Hammurabi, that if a female slave in this situation has born a son and then starts claiming equality, in other words, the female slave starts thinking, oh, I'm not a female slave anymore. Now that I've born this child, I'm much more than that. She has claimed equality with her mistress because she has poor children. Her mistress may now sell her. She may mark her with the slave mark and count her among the slaves. What is being emphasized in the Code of Hammurabi is that Sarai's subsequent actions, when Hagar starts to resent Sarai a little bit more, for example, in Pasuk Daled, Vatekal Gvirta Be'eneha, that if Sarai was here and Hagar is here, now that Hagar becomes pregnant, Hagar basically says, wait a second, if you can't get pregnant and I can, Sarai, you're no better than me, right? I am going to be the one who's going to be able to fulfill these destinies. And Sarai is lowered in Hagar's estimation. What the Code of Hammurabi would seem to suggest is that Sarai's reaction to that, when she says, when Pasuk Vav describes Sarai's reaction, but Te'aneh Sarai abuses her, seems to be very much how the Code of Hammurabi would suggest is appropriate for the mistress to act. Sarai and Avram are acting in a manner which is in accordance to their time period, as jarring and as uncomfortable it is for our modern understanding. And yet, although you might say this surrogacy is expected, legal, and fits within this time period, Ramban emphasizes the family of Avram and Sarai, they were expected to go beyond. And Ramban says quite forcefully, Chata imenu be'inoi hazeh, v'gam Avram, that Avram and Sarai missed the mark. And I doubt Ramban was aware of patriarchal and time periods from a historical perspective. It doesn't matter. Ramban is looking at their actions and he's saying, we can understand it. We can understand how painful it must be to keep being told by Hashem, you're going to be the father and the mother of a great nation, and not to be able to have a child who can start fulfilling that mission. But this is not ethical. This is not in a sense Ritzon Hashem, even though we can have a great deal of compassion for Sarai and for her infertility and for her actions. And Ramban doesn't point this out, but the language that he hints to, he doesn't point it out explicitly, but I think he noticed that the language of Inoi, Vate'aneh Sarai, is something that is an echo of Breshit Perek Tedvav. Because in Brit Navtarim, in the immediate preceding parak, Hashem comes to Avram and he spells out that their future nation is going to be going through Inoi. Hashem says in Breshit Perek Tedvav Pasuk Yud Gimel, Ve'inu otam 400 shana. Your future descendants will be oppressed. And Hashem basically spells out how your descendants will be a ger Yazaracha. They will be oppressed. I, Hashem, right? I will give them a name. I will, in a situation where others try to negate their identity, Hashem will come and give them a destiny, give them an identity. And so you can see how, in a tragic manner, what perhaps Ramban is suggesting is that Avram Avinu and Sarah Imenu heard parts of Brit Navtarim, but they somehow didn't hear some parts of it. And so what's required is a tikkun in Perek Tet Zayin for their actions. Because in the beginning of this story, you see how Sarai is acting in a manner that is perhaps somewhat reminiscent of Chava and perhaps also reminiscent of the society of Migdal Bavel. Because she says, Ulai ibaneh mimena, maybe I will be built up through her. That's the same language as the society of Migdal Bavel. They wanted to build, right, Nilbana, they wanted to build a tower, and that's going to be their destiny. And they imagine that Hagar will simply be a nothing, a vessel for this dream. And literally the name Hagar, Hagar, right? They heard from Hashem, Ger Yazaracha, and here they have in their family a ger, a foreigner, and yet instead of acting in a way that Hashem promises to act for the future descendants, giving a name to the nameless, giving a destiny where there could be a block, they negate that. And they unfortunately treat Hagar as simply a vessel for their own identity, for their own dreams. And so Hashem in Bereshit Parak Vav promises to give Bnei Yisrael a future and a destiny, a gift of a destiny where there was one. Hashem later comes to Bnei Yisrael and speaks to them in the wilderness, as he does to Hagar. In the subsequent psukim, when Hagar runs away, Hagar sees Malach Hashem in the wilderness, and Hagar gets a promise from Hashem, which is essentially the same promise Hashem gives to Avram's descendants, which is, I will give you a destiny, I will give you a name, you will no longer be nameless and be blocked. Hagar is basically promised that the child that she will bear will be her child, and that this child will be a free spirit, and that Yishmael will be somebody who will be bound to nobody and will not be a slave. And the parallel language.
Oh, hi, Uncle David. How are you?
The parallel.
Baruch Hashem. Nice little. Thank you. What?
Also muted. Okay, there we go. So the parallel language emphasizes that this kind of yibum is an abuse, and that not having a name, this is going to become a core part of Bnei Yisrael's identity. We remember Yetziat Mitzrayim because we know how painful it is to be blocked in that way. And we know that destiny and that creating a future becomes so much beyond what happens in the immediate now. And that explains, I think, in what Avram and Sarah do, or the missteps that they have with Hagar. I think that explains a small piece about why something like Yibum is such a big mitzvah. Because you're seeing with intense creativity and selflessness that there can be a future where there might otherwise not have been. And nowhere is this more powerful than in the story of Megillat Ruth, which is the final episode that I'd like to study with you this morning. Because for years, I understood the story of Megillat Ruth as a story where Ruth and Boaz step up. Really, it seems Ruth, in my mind, is who I always thought was the heroine of the story. But when you look at the story of Megillat Ruth through the lens of really Yibum and connect it to all these other stories, you see how each of the three protagonists, all three of them, Naomi, Boaz, and of course Ruth, are all acting in a way that defines chesed in the sense of seeking destiny for others. Because Ruth seeks a destiny, obviously, for Naomi, right? Ruth completely just looks at Naomi and says, I want to cling to you. I want to be a future for you. Boaz obviously looks at Ruth and Naomi and says, what can I do for the two of you? And Naomi, I think, in this reading, is also seeking a destiny for Ruth, right? Naomi's motivations are additionally almost self-abnegation and a destiny for Ruth. So all of them have in mind each other. So let's see how this plays out. Ruth obviously adopts Naomi as her family, despite the fact that the son, the husband who bound them together, has since died. She agrees with Naomi's plan that she should marry Boaz to carry on the name of the deceased family, and that the ancestral plans will be called in his name. And this proto-Yibum, right, not really exactly defined by the Gemara as Yibum, right, shows that to be able to do this for somebody else is an amazing act of chesed. Boaz, in contrast to this individual, Ploni Almoni, is defined by this as well. Because as we know, Ploni Almoni is a relative who Boaz names when Ruth appears to him in the Goren, and is a relative who is even closer than Boaz, whose real responsibility is it, or who really has the rights and the privileges of buying back the ancestral lands and marrying Ruth. And what's fascinating is that in Megillat Ruth Perek Daled, when we come to the kind of tying up of the loose ends of Megillat Ruth, when Boaz finds Ploni Almoni, he's introduced in a few different ways. Boaz Allah Hashar Vayeshav Sham V'hinei Hagoel Over Asher Diber Boaz. The Redeemer who Boaz has already mentioned to Ruth, the person who really should be marrying you and buying back the ancestral fields, is there. And he is called Hagoel, the person who is the Redeemer. Almost reminiscent of like the way we think of Hashem in the Yetziat Mitzrayim story, right? The Goel, the Redeemer. And then in the next pasuk, when Boaz initiates, and in the subsequent psukim, when Boaz initiates conversation with him, he is named Ploni Almoni, which isn't his name. It's like saying, you know, John Smith or Jane Doe, right? It's not really a name, it's anonymous. And so it's fascinating that for somebody who is given two different kind of anonymous titles or anonymous markers, is really emphasizing that what his responsibility is to be Makayim Hashem for the dead man. And his inability to do that, I think, is why Megillat Ruth doesn't give him a name. Says, here's the potential you could have been Goel, but you refuse that. And so you're simply Ploni Almoni. I want to emphasize also that Ploni Almoni in this conversation with Boaz basically says, I am willing to have the fields. I'm willing to buy the property for it to be known as my ancestral fields, but I'm not willing to marry Ruth. In other words, I'm willing to have the land. I'm just not willing to have the land be called by this family, and for me to have to kind of lose out on calling this land by my name. In other words, he's willing to have the benefit, but he's not willing to have any of the selflessness required to do Yibum. And Boaz stands in contrast to that. The conclusion of Megillat Ruth, right? Obviously, the baby that's born to Ruth and Boaz basically becomes Nomi's son, in a sense, right? Vatikach Nomi et hayeled v'tishiteu b'cheka v'tihi lo le'omenet v'tikrana lo ashchanot shem lemor yulad ben leNami, right? Nami basically becomes this foster mother of this child. And I think you see here a closing of a full circle for Nami as well. Because when we encounter Nami in the beginning of the Megillah, she has no hope. She's completely broken. Ruth sees in Nami the potential for a destiny, and Nami only steps up to act once she realizes that potentially there is a future to be built for Ruth. And this is what I mean when I say that all three of the characters are acting in a manner where they see a destiny for somebody else. Because in Pasuk Gimel, in Perek Gimel, when Nomi realizes that potentially Boaz could be somebody Ruth can marry, he says, Halo avakesh lach manoach asher yitav lach. Nomi turns to Ruth and she says, hey, I don't care about myself, right? I could happily keep on gleaning and being a pauper and collecting scraps every single day. But I think I have a way for you, Ruth, to have a future. And in doing so, right, when Nami is able to see a future for Ruth, she doesn't care about herself, she then creates a future for herself. And so it closes full circle. I think we fear sometimes that in adopting somebody else's destiny as our own, we'll lose a piece of ourselves. You know, Chava viewed Cain as her complete destiny, and in Shet, she created a destiny for Hevel as a sort of Yibum. And Avram and Sarah were chosen because they were willing to demonstrate that destiny and a future is so much more than just a monument. like Migdal Bavel. It's your actions that are your legacy. And they needed to learn that lesson before they were granted the gift of having Yitzchak. They struggled with how to fulfill Hashem's destiny and promises without negating others, such as Hagar. And this idea of a ger, being a slave who others look at and negate their destiny, negate their identity, then becomes the identity of Am Yisrael. And that is why Yetziat Mitzrayim is such a core memory of our identity as a people. And in Megillat Ruth, we saw, through this act of chesed, the ability to devote time and love and care and life into giving somebody else a purpose, an identity. You don't lose yourself in that endeavor. That's where you find yourself. You know, Tzipi lived a life that was filled with giving to others, helping others see their potential, helping others see their greatness. And she, at her core, knew that being somebody who built up others did not cause herself to be diminished, not one iota. Like the metaphor of an educator as a flame, somebody who kindles a flame and makes a new fire without any of that fire being diminished or negated. I met Tzipi and Ephraim when Ezra and I just moved to Chicago away from our family and friends, and she became my funny, sarcastic, inspiring Israeli sister when I needed one the most. I struggled to acclimate to living in West Rogers Park and teaching at Ida Crown, and she basically found me, dusted me off, and built me up. I remember within the first few weeks of meeting Tzipi, she invited Ezra and me to join her Friday night in their apartment. And she realized, and I think Ephraim and Ezra were discussing mutual friends from the Gush. And Tzipi just kind of turned to me and she said, "Oh, how old are you?" We were trying to figure out what grades, and obviously we had no mutual friends. And she simply said, "Oh, you know what, Adina, I think we would have been in the same Bnei Akiva Shevet." And just like that, two women who came from completely different backgrounds. I grew up in Brooklyn, going to Beis Yaakov. Trust me, I never was in any Bnei Akiva Shevet. She basically said, "No, you're in my Shevet, right?" And she basically kind of collected me and said, you're one of us, you're mine now." And she collected friendships, right? She collected all of you on the screen. She viewed relationships and students, again, as a flame that she could just cultivate. I remember complaining to her endlessly about school culture. And she basically said, "Okay, so let's plan events to improve school culture at Ida Crown." I remember worrying I wouldn't be able to grow. I wouldn't have opportunities for my own growth in Chicago. And so she decided, she made a rule that I had to speak to her in Hebrew and she had to speak to me in English. And we really kept to that rule. And we only broke the rule when one of us had a very important piece of gossip. So then we basically, switched to the language of whoever was sharing the gossip. So if it was Tzipi, it was Hebrew, and if it was me, it was English for the gossip part. And my Hebrew improved tremendously, and I still keep to that rule with the shlichim in whatever school I'm in. She started training to be a college teacher, and I remember she told me, and I had no interest of any of that at the time, and she told me, "Oh, Adina, give it some time, you'll do that too." And I became a Yoetz Halacha. Because she saw in me, she saw in Ephraim, she saw in her own children, and she saw in others potential and growth. And she told people about that, right? She would turn to people and she would say, "You're amazing, you could do this." And people who they themselves didn't think that they could do any of the things that she saw in them were able to do that. Because she had a belief that each soul she encountered was crucial to building up Am Yisrael. And I was blessed, I'll share this with you. I was looking through an old Ida Crown yearbook. In her last year, we shared the dedication of the yearbook, and the students dedicated it to both of us. And it was because of Tzipi, because I was an introverted teacher who really was not interested in doing anything beyond just teaching my Tanach classes. And she basically said, "No, Adina, you'll do all these things with me." And I did. And she just turned to people and said, "You'll do this." And they did, and they listened. And her smile, just the way that you described the Gvura, Rabbi Brand, I think perfectly encapsulates who she was. And so she leaves a legacy that we must carry on, recognizing that in our efforts to turn to others and show them kindness, and build people up and make others aware of their potential, we will not be diminished. That is the legacy of Tzipi. Yehi Zichram Baruch.
Thank you so much, Adina. Thank you, Ephraim, for enabling us this morning. Adina, while we miss you here in Chicago, we know that your students at Mizrahi, the women in Green Road, the Beechwood, University Heights, Greater Cleveland community is the beneficiary of your tremendous wisdom and insight, humility and humanity and caring. And we really appreciate your sharing both the Torah today and this inspiring message to take home, that halavai, we can live your words. And the same way that Tzipi lit up each of us and showed us our potential like that Ner, as we turn toward Hanukkah, it'll be an opportunity for us to continue to enrich ourselves with the light that she showed us. Yehi Zichra Baruch. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Adina, such a beautiful tribute. We should get together for Simchas and Nachas. All the best, Shavua Tov, everyone. Thank you.